The day they betrayed me was the day I bought their company. My son, David, stared at me from across the polished mahogany table, his expression a mixture of confusion and the same smug arrogance I'd seen at my retirement party. He thought he was addressing the board of a company he'd cleverly bankrupted to build his own. He was about to find out he was addressing its new owner. The scent of old leather and new beginnings filled the air in Arthur Sterling's home, a sprawling Tudor he had designed himself 3 decades prior. 60 years. The number felt both impossibly large and strangely insignificant. From his wingback chair, he watched the party flow around him, a river of familiar faces and warm laughter. His daughter, Chloe, glided through the room, her smile as bright as the champagne flute in her hand. And there, holding court by the fireplace, were David and Marcus, his son and his son-in-law. The firm, Sterling Son Architects, was theirs now, and Arthur felt a profound, bone-deep satisfaction in that. He had built it from nothing, sketching designs on diner napkins and making promises on a handshake. Had poured his life into its foundations, valuing integrity over profit margins, legacy over fleeting trends. Handing the reins to David, with Marcus as his study partner, had been the capstone of his career. They were sharper, more attuned to the modern market's ruthless pace. They had doubled the firm's revenue in 3 years, a feat that made Arthur swell with a quiet, paternal pride. David caught his eye and raised his glass, a gesture of silent acknowledgement. He was his mother's son in looks, the same dark hair and easy charm, but he had Arthur's ambition, honed to a razor's edge. Marcus, ever the shadow, nodded beside him. He was the numbers man, the strategist who translated David's grand visions into concrete, profitable realities. Together, they were formidable. They were the future. Later, David stood to make a toast. The room hushed, the gentle clinking of ice in glasses the only sound. "To my father," he began, his voice clear and resonant. "A man who taught us that a building is more than just steel and glass. It's a legacy. He laid the foundation, and we are honored to build upon it." The words were perfect. They settled over Arthur like a warm blanket, chasing away the faint chill of semi-retirement. He looked at the faces around him, employees, clients, family, all nodding in agreement. This was his life's work, not just the firm, but this web of relationships, this community. He felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost buckled him. He had done well. As the evening began to wane and the crowd thinned, Arthur slipped away from the living room, heading toward his study for a bottle of single malt he'd been saving. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light cutting across the dark hallway. He heard voices from within, David and Marcus. He paused, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like a private business conversation. "The final transfer should clear by Tuesday," Marcus said, his voice stripped of its usual deference. It was flat, clinical. "The legacy accounts are almost fully leveraged." "Good," David's reply was a low murmur, sharp and impatient. "The sooner we can cut the dead weight loose, the better. We can't have his sentimentality dragging on the new venture's balance sheet." Arthur's hand froze on the doorknob. "Dead weight. Sentimentality." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp as broken glass. He leaned closer, his heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. "Are you sure he wants to look into it?" Marcus asked, a note of caution in his tone. A short, dismissive laugh from David. "Look into what?" "He's too busy polishing his own monument. He hears what he wants to hear. Tonight proved that. He sees a legacy, I see leverage. Once we drain the last of the goodwill his name provides, we sink the old ship and sail on." Arthur stepped back from the door, a sudden cold seeping into his bones that had nothing to do with the night air. He felt a distinct, physical sensation, as if a load-bearing wall inside him had just given way. He turned and walked silently back to the dwindling party, the festive noise now sounding distant and alien. He watched his son clap a departing guest on the back, a perfect, charming smile fixed on his face. It was a mask. Everything was a mask. And Arthur, the master architect, had just seen the crumbling foundation beneath it all. Sleep did not come. The echoes of the party had long since faded, replaced by the funereal ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Each tick was a hammer blow, driving the words deeper into Arthur's mind. Dead weight. Sink the old ship. He lay in the dark, the warmth of his wife, Eleanor, beside him, a stark contrast to the ice forming in his veins. He had feigned a headache, a plausible excuse to retire early, but the performance felt hollow. Deceit, he was discovering, was a language his own family spoke fluently. Before the sun had even considered rising, Arthur was in his study. The room, once a sanctuary of blueprints and memories, now felt like a command center for a war he hadn't known he was fighting. He powered on his desktop, the hum of the machine a low growl in the stillness. They had left him his founder's credentials for the company server, a legacy login with top-tier clearance. It was an act of either sentimental respect or, more likely, supreme arrogance. They simply didn't believe the old man would ever look. He navigated to the financial archives, his fingers moving across the keyboard with a forgotten fluency. He started with the quarterly reports. On the surface, everything was pristine. Profits were up, client acquisition was strong, the very picture of health that David had painted in his birthday toast. But a good architect knows that the most critical flaws are never on the facade, they are hidden in the foundations. He bypassed the polished summaries and dove into the raw expenditure logs. For hours, he scrolled through an ocean of data, line items blurring into a meaningless stream of figures. He was searching for a single loose thread. He decided to audit a project he knew intimately, the renovation of the old city library, a commission he had won 30 years ago. He knew its costs, its suppliers, its very soul. And there it was. A recent invoice for structural consultation services from a vendor he had never heard of, Apex Logistical Solutions. The fee was substantial, nearly 6 figures. It was plausible, but odd. The library's core structure was sound as bedrock, he had ensured it himself. He clicked on the vendor ID. The system showed a dozen other payments to Apex over the last 18 months, all for similarly vague services across multiple projects. The total was staggering. Arthur opened a new browser window, his movements now sharp and precise. A search for Apex Logistical Solutions yielded a sterile, one-page website filled with corporate jargon and stock photos of smiling executives. There was no client list, no portfolio, no names. The corporate registration led him to a post office box in Delaware. It was a ghost, a digital phantom created for the sole purpose of receiving money. His breath hitched. This was not a mistake. This was a mechanism. He returned to the server, his search now targeted. He cross-referenced the payment authorization codes for every Apex invoice. Each one bore the digital signature of Marcus, countersigned by David. A cold, methodical anger began to replace the hurt. This was his son's signature on a ghost-ass paycheck. He kept digging. He found another phantom, a design firm called Orion Design Ventures, which was being paid handsomely for preliminary project viability assessments. Arthur pulled up the assessments. They were for projects he himself had vetoed years ago as financially or architecturally unsound. They were recycling his rejections, dressing them up as new business, and using them as a pipeline to drain capital from the company he built. He began mapping the connections on a legal pad, the architect in him instinctively drawing lines and nodes. Apex for logistics, Orion for design. 2 arteries bleeding his firm dry. The payments were structured to fall just below the threshold that would trigger an automatic board review. It was clever. It was meticulous. It was a carefully designed demolition, happening 1 floor at a time, while the tenants were still inside. Leaning back in his leather chair, Arthur stared at the diagram he had sketched. It wasn't a series of random thefts. It was a blueprint. The cold light of the monitor illuminated his face, etching new lines of grim understanding. The whispers from the party were no longer just a betrayal of a father by his son, they were the confession of a conspiracy to dismantle a legacy, piece by stolen piece. And he, the master architect, was the intended ruin. Arthur knew the limits of his own expertise. He could read a blueprint, spot a structural flaw from 100 yards, but navigating the labyrinth of corporate finance law was like trying to build a skyscraper in a fog. His initial reconnaissance had given him the coordinates of the problem. Now he needed a specialist to map the territory and expose every hidden crevice. He made a call to a name had been given decades ago by his first lawyer, a name to be used only when the stakes were absolute: Julian Vance. They met a week later in a sterile, anonymous conference room downtown that Vance had booked under a holding company's name. Vance was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of sharp angles and quiet calculations. He wore a gray suit that matched his hair, and his eyes, behind thin-rimmed glasses, missed nothing. He didn't offer condolences or commentary. He simply opened a slim leather portfolio and placed a bound report on the table between them. It was an inch thick and felt as heavy as a tombstone. "Your suspicions were not only correct, Mr. Sterling," Vance began, his voice as dry as old parchment. "They were an understatement." He turned to the first tab, a flowchart that made Arthur's stomach clench. On the left was the familiar logo of Sterling Sun. A series of arrows, representing wire transfers, flowed from it into two boxes labeled Apex Logistical Solutions and Orion Design Ventures. Arthur recognized his own late-night scribblings, now rendered in professional, undeniable clarity. But Vance had added a new, devastating layer. More arrows flowed out from Apex and Orion, converging on a single, final entity on the right side of the page, a company named Paragon Group. Paragon Group was incorporated 6 months after Mr. Marcus joined your firm, Vance stated, tapping a neatly manicured finger on the box. The sole directors and shareholders are David Sterling and Marcus Thorne. Your son and your son-in-law. Arthur said nothing. He stared at the name. Paragon. The arrogance of it was a slap in the face. Vance turned the page to a series of bank statements. They've been siphoning funds methodically. The money from your company paid for Paragon's incorporation fees, their office lease in the new financial district, their marketing materials, even their salaries. Sterling Sun has been unknowingly funding its own executioner. The next section was even worse. It contained copies of emails, acquired legally through a digital forensics team Vance had employed. They were communications between David, Marcus, and several of Sterling Sun's most valuable, long-standing clients. The messages were slick, professional, and utterly damning. They spoke of a dynamic new venture, promising next-generation efficiency and subtly painting Sterling Sun as a legacy firm burdened by an outdated, conservative approach. His approach. They were using his reputation as a foundation from which to launch their attack against him. Their strategy is quite clear, Vance continued, his tone unwavering. They are running 2 sets of books. For Sterling Sun, they are inflating expenses and leveraging assets to the breaking point, creating a narrative of decline. For Paragon, they are lining up your clients, ready to transfer them the moment your firm is declared insolvent. They don't just want to leave, they want to ensure there is nothing left to salvage. They intend to leave you holding the bag, the debts, the lawsuits, the ruin. Arthur slowly closed the report. The polished cover felt cold beneath his fingertips. The pain of the initial betrayal had been a sharp, hot wound. This was different. This was a cold, spreading poison. This was not a moment of weakness or a simple act of greed. This was a calculated, multi-year campaign of demolition, designed by his own son to erase him. He looked at Vance, whose expression remained impassive, a professional courtesy that Arthur suddenly found deeply comforting. There was no room for emotion here. There was only the architecture of the deceit, laid bare on the page. And Arthur, the builder, knew exactly what one does when a structure is rotten to its core. He requested the meeting in the main conference room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the city skyline, a view that had always made him feel like he was looking at a living blueprint of his own history. He arrived early, placing 2 identical copies of Julian Vance's report on the polished mahogany table, one at each of the seats opposite his own. He didn't key open them. Their sheer, professional weight was an accusation in itself. David and Marcus walked in together, a subtle air of confidence around them that had not been there a few years ago. It was the easy assurance of men who believed they held all the cards. They saw the binders and their expressions tighten almost imperceptibly. "Dad," David began, a note of forced casualness in his voice. "What is this about? We've got the quarterly review next week." Arthur didn't answer immediately. He let the silence hang in the air, a heavy, suffocating thing. He simply gestured to the chairs. "Sit down." They exchanged a quick, unreadable glance before complying. Marcus reached for the report, but David placed a hand on his forearm, stopping him. He looked directly at his father, his eyes clear and unblinking. "This feels formal," David said, a hint of a challenge in his tone. "It is," Arthur replied, his voice level and devoid of the tremor he felt in his chest. "I had a financial audit conducted. An independent one." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It was very thorough. It details the formation of a company called Paragon Group, its funding sources, and its business strategy." The facade of nonchalance cracked. Marcus paled slightly, his gaze dropping to the table. David, however, held his father's stare. The flicker of surprise in his eyes was quickly extinguished, replaced by something hard and calculating. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, deliberate movement that was pure theater. "An audit," David repeated, as if tasting the word. "You went behind our backs." "A strange accusation," Arthur said, the irony thick as tar, "coming from you." David offered a humorless smile. "So you know." "Good. It saves us a rather tedious conversation. I suppose you're here for an apology." "No," Arthur said quietly. "I'm here for an explanation. Though I suspect I already have it." It was then that the last vestiges of the son Arthur knew vanished. The man who sat across from him was a stranger, armored in ambition. An explanation. "The world moved on, Dad. You built this firm for a different era, one of handshakes and long lunches. That world is gone. We're faster, more aggressive. We had to be." "This isn't aggression," Arthur countered, his voice still low but now edged with steel. "This is theft. You've been bleeding this company dry to build its replacement. You've been lying to clients, to employees, to your family." "It's business," Marcus interjected, finally finding his voice, though it was thin and reedy. "A strategic asset reallocation. We are building something stronger, unburdened by." "By what?" Arthur cut him off, his gaze fixed on David. "By integrity. By loyalty. By me." David leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. The coldness in his eyes was absolute, a chilling void where affection and respect used to be. "You were the dead weight. Your name, your reputation, it was an asset, and we leveraged it. But your methods, your sentimentality, were a liability. You gave us the keys, but you never stopped looking over our shoulder, judging. This wasn't just about money. It was about getting out from under the shadow of your legacy so we could build our own." The word struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow, yet his expression remained unchanged. He had come here holding on to a fool's hope, a tiny, ember-like belief that this was some gross misunderstanding. That hope was now ash. There was no remorse in their faces. There was only justification. They saw themselves as visionaries, pioneers breaking free from a fossilized past. They saw him not as a father they had betrayed, but as an obstacle they had overcome. Arthur stood up slowly. The meeting was over. The family he knew was gone, and these 2 men were simply hostile actors who had staged a successful coup. "I see," he said, and the 2 words carried the weight of a final judgment. He turned and walked to the door, leaving the damning report sitting on the table like twin epitaphs. He didn't need them anymore. He had what he came for, the undeniable, chilling truth. His resolve, once a fractured thing of grief and doubt, was now forged into something hard and clear. This was no longer about saving a relationship. It was about protecting a lifetime of work from the people he had once trusted to preserve it. The emotional devastation of the confrontation left Arthur feeling hollowed out, like a building gutted by fire. The structure remained, but the interior was ash. He did not retreat into grief, however. An architect does not mourn a condemned structure, he draws up the plans for a new one. For 2 days, he sequestered himself in his study, not with family photos, but with financial statements and legal texts. Then, he made 2 calls. His war council convened not in an office, but in the private library of an old city club, a room paneled in dark oak, smelling of aged paper and quiet power. Isabel Rocha, his lawyer for the past 15 years, sat to his left. She was a woman of sharp lines and sharper intellect, her presence radiating a calm, formidable competence. Across from them sat a man Arthur had spent a decade competing against, Kenji Chen, a financier whose name was spoken with a mixture of awe and fear in the city's boardrooms. Chen was compact and still, a man who moved with the quiet economy of someone who measures the world in basis points. Arthur had slid copies of Ans's report across the table to them beforehand. There was no need to retell the sordid details of the betrayal. They were there to discuss the response. The legal options are straightforward but unsatisfying, Isabel began, her fingers steepled. We can sue them for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. We would win. But it would be a public, bloody affair that would drag the company's name through the mud for years. By the time the dust settles, there will be nothing left but scorched earth. And Paragon Group will have conveniently absorbed all the valuable assets and clients, Chen added, his voice soft but carrying immense weight. They have designed the collapse of Sterling Sun to be the launchpad for their own success. A classic vampire acquisition. Arthur nodded, appreciating their immediate grasp of the situation. They saw the mechanics, not just the emotion. Exactly. I do not want to destroy the firm. There are 200 employees whose livelihoods depend on it. I built it to last, not to be a casualty in a family feud. So, this isn't about retribution, Isabel stated, her eyes searching his. This is about restoration, Arthur corrected her firmly. They used financial leverage to break my company. I want to use financial leverage to take it back. He slid a single sheet of paper into the center of the table. On it was a simple diagram. A box labeled SS Dead had an arrow pointing to a new box labeled Third-Party SPV. Chen picked it up, a flicker of deep interest in his eyes. He looked at Arthur, a new respect dawning on his face. You want to buy the debt? They've been taking out loans against the firm's assets to fund Paragon, Arthur explained, his voice the calm, measured tone of a man outlining a blueprint. The debt is being sold off in tranches to creditors. They believe no single entity will care enough to challenge them when they eventually file for bankruptcy. They are counting on the apathy of a scattered portfolio. But if one entity quietly buys up a controlling interest in that debt, Isabel continued, the legal implications already forming in her mind. That entity becomes the primary creditor. And the primary creditor dictates the terms of any bankruptcy or restructuring. They would be walking into a creditor's meeting to negotiate with a room full of strangers, Chen finished, a rare, thin smile touching his lips. Only to find out they are negotiating with you. The audacious simplicity of the plan hung in the room. It was not a frontal assault. It was an ambush, laid with the enemy's own weapons. It was precise, legal, and utterly devastating. It can be done, Chen said after a moment, his mind already running the numbers. We would need to set up a series of shell corporations, special-purpose vehicles, to act as firewalls. We buy the debt through them, anonymously. They will never see us coming. And when we have control, Isabel added, we can force a restructuring that ousts the current management and invalidates any fraudulent transfers to Paragon. We can claw it all back. Arthur looked at the two of them. His lawyer, the guardian of the law, and his former rival, the master of capital. They were not friends bound by sentiment, but professionals aligned by a shared respect for strategy and a shared contempt for the sloppy, arrogant brand of destruction David and Marcus represented. This is not revenge, Arthur said, his voice low and steady as he met both their gazes. This is a necessary, defensive response. They have declared war on my life's work. I am simply choosing the battlefield. The weeks that followed were a blur of silent, meticulous activity. From a discreet office suite leased by one of Chen's holding companies, Arthur watched the plan unfold. He was no longer a retired architect, he was the silent partner in a ghost operation. Chen, in his element, moved through the opaque world of secondary debt markets with the silent grace of a shark. He established a constellation of special-purpose vehicles, impersonal entities with names like Ironwood Capital and Juniper Holdings, each domiciled in a different state, each designed to be a black hole for information. Arthur's role was to provide the capital. He liquidated a significant portion of his personal portfolio, investments he had earmarked for a quiet retirement of travel and grandchildren. The irony was bitter. He was spending his future to reclaim his past. Each transfer of funds felt like a piece of his life being fed into a machine, but it was a machine of his own design, aimed at a single, necessary purpose. The first tranche of Sterling Sun debt came up for sale on a private market. It was a small block, held by a regional bank growing nervous about the firm's increasingly leveraged position. Chen's team, operating through Ironwood Capital, purchased it for 60 cents on the dollar. To the seller, it was a prudent offloading of a risky asset. To David and Marcus, who would have received a cursory notification of the transfer, it was a non-event, just another faceless creditor swapping paper. They wouldn't have given the name Ironwood a second thought. This became the pattern. As David and Marcus continued to take on more debt, stretching the firm's credit to its breaking point to funnel cash into Paragon, Chen was always waiting in the shadows. He bought up distressed commercial paper from anxious investment funds and secured loans from hedge funds looking to de-risk their portfolios. He never bought too much at once, never from a single source. Each purchase was a small, quiet transaction, lost in the noise of the market. But cumulatively, they were building a siege wall around Sterling Sun, brick by invisible brick. During this time, Arthur had to maintain a careful, agonizing neutrality at home. Chloe would call, her voice strained, asking why he and David weren't speaking. It's a business disagreement, he would say, the words tasting like ash. He has his vision, I have mine. He couldn't tell her that her husband and brother were systematically dismantling his legacy. The truth would shatter her world, and that was a piece of collateral damage he was unwilling to accept. So he played the part of the stubborn, slightly wounded father, a role that was painfully close to the truth yet a universe away from the whole story. One evening, Chen called him. "They've taken the bait," he said, his voice clipped with professional satisfaction. "They've just secured a major line of credit from a venture capital firm, collateralized against future earnings and all remaining hard assets. They're making a final push to drain the company before they file for bankruptcy. Can we acquire it?" Arthur asked, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "Not directly. This one is different. But the VC firm has already packaged and resold a significant portion of it to mitigate their own exposure," Chen explained. "It's now classified as high-risk corporate debt. My people are already in position to buy it. At a steep discount, I might add. Their recklessness is making this cheaper for us." Arthur looked out his study window at the city lights. Each light was a story, a home, a business. He had spent his life adding to that skyline, building things that were meant to stand for a century. His son was treating it all like a pile of chips at a casino table. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. David and Marcus were so focused on the future they were building with Paragon, they never once thought to look back at the company they were destroying. They saw its debt as a burden to be shed, not as a weapon that could be turned against them. They believed their father was a relic of the past, defeated and irrelevant. They had no idea that he was, with every passing day, becoming their future. He was becoming their single largest, and soon to be their only, creditor. A structure is more than its steel and stone, it is the people who give it life. Arthur knew this better than anyone. Owning the debt would give him legal control of the company as shall, but Sterling Sun was a living entity, an ecosystem of talent, experience, and relationships. If he reclaimed a building full of employees who had lost faith or clients who had already fled, he would have won nothing but a name on a deed. The financial front of his war was being expertly managed by Chen. Now, Arthur had to tend to the human element. His first meeting was with Elena Varga, the head of the drafting department. He had hired her straight out of university 25 years ago, recognizing a rare blend of artistic vision and engineering pragmatism. He invited her for coffee at a small cafe far from the financial district, under the pretense of seeking her advice on the design for a local community center, a pro bono project he was considering. After they had discussed the hypothetical layouts, he steered the conversation gently. "How are things at the office, Elena? Is the work still challenging?" Her face, usually open and expressive, became guarded. "It's different," she said, choosing her words with care. "Faster. The focus is on billable hours. We're using more prefabricated templates. It's efficient." The word efficient was delivered with a complete lack of enthusiasm. "Efficiency is good," Arthur said, stirring his coffee. "But not when it becomes the goal itself. The goal is to build something that lasts." He looked at her directly. "Tell me, if you saw a beautiful old building being stripped of its character from the inside out, its foundations being neglected for the sake of a cheap, modern facade, what would be your duty as an architect?" Elena met his gaze, and for the first time, the professional caution in her eyes gave way to a weary frustration. "My duty would be to the building," she said, her voice low but firm. "To preserve its integrity. To remind those in charge what they are destroying. Even if they don't want to listen." It was the answer he needed. He didn't offer her a job or hint at a coup. He simply gave her a reason to endure. Hold on to that principle, Elena. Integrity is a foundation. It can be shaken, but a well-built one never truly breaks. Good people will be needed to rebuild when the time comes. He left it at that, a cryptic promise that was also a profound vote of confidence. His next lunch was with Richard Peterson, a real estate developer whose firm had been a client of Sterling Sun since the very beginning. They had built more than a dozen projects together, their relationship founded on mutual respect and a shared disdain for cutting corners. "Arthur, it's not the same," Peterson said, pushing a piece of salmon around his plate. "I talked to David, and it's all about synergy and maximizing ROI. I feel like I'm being upsold, not consulted. Marcus sends me proposals padded with fees for logistical oversight that we never needed before. They don't listen. They pitch." Arthur listened without interruption, letting the man's frustration fill the space between them. He heard the same story of disillusionment he had felt himself. The soul of the company was being replaced by a spreadsheet. "Reputation is a fragile thing, Richard," Arthur said when the developer had finished. "It takes a lifetime to build and a moment of carelessness to shatter. I put my name on that firm because it stood for something." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking for a little patience. Don't let a temporary change in management sour a 30-year partnership. Leadership can be a revolving door. The principles a company is built on should be permanent. Give me some time. I believe the Sterling Sun you remember will be back." He wasn't asking for a contract or a commitment. He was appealing to their shared history, reinforcing the very foundation of loyalty and trust that David and Marcus had deemed a liability. He was quietly checking the load-bearing walls of his legacy, ensuring they would hold when the weight was transferred. He was building a government in exile, a network of allies who didn't know the specifics of the coming liberation, only that it was on the horizon. The meeting was held in a soulless, beige conference room in a downtown law office, the kind of place where corporate futures are decided under the flat glare of fluorescent lights. David and Marcus entered with the relaxed demeanor of men executing the final, simple step of a long and brilliant campaign. To them, this was a formality. They were here to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy for Sterling Sun, a strategic maneuver to shed the company's debts and its founder's legacy, before seamlessly transitioning their clients and assets to the pristine balance sheets of Paragon Group. They looked rested, successful, victorious. Their lawyer, a sleek man with a politician's smile, laid out the situation to the assembled creditors. Or rather, to the handful of junior lawyers and accountants sent to represent them. The room was sparsely populated. Most of the smaller creditors had already sold off their debt, assuming they would get pennies on the dollar at best. David and Marcus saw this as confirmation of their strategy's genius. No one cared enough to fight. And so, their lawyer concluded, Sterling Sun proposes a liquidation plan that will satisfy a portion of its outstanding obligations, allowing for an orderly dissolution of the company. He gestured for questions. There was a brief silence. Then, from the back of the room, a clear voice cut through the stale air. We have a counter-proposal. All heads turned. Isabel Rocher stood, a slim leather portfolio in her hand. She did not look at David or Marcus. She addressed the bankruptcy trustee at the head of the table. David squinted, a flicker of annoyance on his face. Isabel? What are you doing here? Representing my father's personal stake. It's negligible. Not exactly, Isabel said, her tone as cool and polished as the table before her. She walked to the front of the room and placed a stack of documents before the trustee. I am here representing the majority creditor in this matter. Juniper Holdings, Ironwood Capital, and several other SPVs have, over the past 7 months, acquired a controlling interest in Sterling Sun as consolidated debt. To be precise, they hold 72%. A stunned silence descended on the room. David and Marcus exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Their lawyer's smile vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. They had meticulously planned for a scattered, indifferent group of creditors they could easily manage. They had never once considered the possibility of a single, unified opponent. Who the hell is Juniper Holdings? Marcus stammered, his composure shattering. As the primary creditor, Isabel continued, ignoring him, her voice cutting like a surgeon's scalpel, we reject the proposed Chapter 11 filing. We see significant value in the firm's assets, brand, and personnel, provided it is managed competently. Therefore, we will be submitting our own plan for restructuring under a debt for equity swap. The trustee, a weary veteran of corporate collapses, looked up from the documents, his eyebrows raised. A debt for equity swap. Who is the principal behind these entities? Isabel finally turned her gaze to David and Marcus. The placid professionalism on her face did not change, but her eyes were like chips of ice. The principal is a private investor with a deep, personal interest in seeing this firm restored to its former standards of integrity and excellence. His name is Arthur Sterling. The name landed in a quiet room with the force of a wrecking ball. The color drained from David's face. The smug confidence he had worn like a tailored suit evaporated, leaving behind a raw, primal disbelief. He stared at Isabel, then around the room as if searching for a hidden camera, an explanation for this impossible turn of events. He had been so sure he was sinking a ship, never realizing his father had been quietly buying the ocean. This is impossible, David whispered, the words barely audible. It's business, Isabel replied, echoing the same cold justification he had once given his father. A strategic asset reallocation. The controlling creditor will now dictate the future of this company. And as of this moment, that creditor is here. On cue, the conference room door opened. Arthur Sterling stepped inside. He did not look angry. He did not look triumphant. He looked like an architect who had come to inspect a faulty structure, his expression one of grim, resolute purpose. He took a seat at the far end of the table, directly opposite his son, and gave a slight, formal nod to the trustee. The trap, so patiently and precisely set, had finally sprung. The bankruptcy proceedings were summarily suspended. As the primary creditor, Arthur now held all the leverage. The next meeting took place a day later, not in a neutral space, but in the main conference room of Sterling's son, the same room where David had justified his betrayal. The view of the city skyline now seemed less like a testament to a legacy and more like a silent, judging audience. It was just the four of them, Arthur and Isabel on one side of the vast mahogany table, David and Marcus on the other. The bravado and arrogance were gone from the two younger men, replaced by a pallid, desperate tension. Their lawyers had already explained the hopelessness of their position. They had walked into a slaughterhouse of their own making. Arthur did not speak at first. He had Isabel lay out the terms of the debt for equity swap. It was a complete conversion. His anonymous holding companies would forgive the entirety of the firm's debt in exchange for 100% of the company's shares. David and Marcus' ownership would be diluted to zero. They would be left with nothing. "This is punitive," Marcus protested, his voice cracking. "You're wiping us out." "No," Arthur said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet, weary, but held the unyielding strength of reinforced concrete. "This is equitable. I am using my own capital to pay off the debts you incurred. In return, I am taking ownership of the company I founded. It seems a fair exchange." David, who had been staring at his father with a mixture of hatred and disbelief, finally spoke. "So that's it? You take everything? What about Paragon? We built that." "You built Paragon with money and resources stolen from this firm," Isabel interjected coolly. "As the new owner of Sterling's son, Mr. Sterling has a fiduciary duty to its interests. And it is in this firm's interest to reclaim all misappropriated assets. We have already begun the legal process to file a civil suit against Paragon Group for fraudulent conveyance. We will seize its assets, its client lists, its intellectual property, everything." The finality of it landed on them like a physical weight. They were not just losing Sterling's son, they were losing the prize for which they had sacrificed everything. They were cornered, and the last, desperate glint of a fight appeared in David's eyes. "We'll fight you," he snarled. "We'll drag this through the courts for a decade. We'll tell the world how the great Arthur Sterling destroyed his own son over a business disagreement." Arthur's expression did not change. He reached down to his briefcase and retrieved a familiar, inch-thick binder, Julian Van Sass' original report. He slid it across the table. It came to a stop directly in front of David. "You seem to be operating under a misapprehension," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You think this is a business negotiation. It isn't. This is a choice. The civil suit is one path. It is messy, public, and damaging to the family name. I would prefer to avoid it." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "But there is another path. This report does not just detail fraudulent conveyance. It details wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. It contains evidence of criminal activity. This is not a document for the civil courts, David. This is a document for the district attorney." He let his gaze rest on his son. There was no anger in it, only a profound, bottomless disappointment. "So here is my final offer. Auction when you sign these papers." Isabel slid a share transfer agreement across the table. "You transfer all your shares in Sterling's son to me. You dissolve Paragon Group and turn over all its assets. You walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back, and this matter remains a private, family tragedy. The report in front of you is locked in a vault." He leaned forward slightly. "Auction 2 you refuse. And this meeting will end with Isabel placing a call to the authorities. You will be arrested. You will be tried. And with this evidence," he tapped the binder, "you will be convicted. You will lose everything anyway, and you will do it from a prison cell." The room was utterly silent. The choice was stark, brutal, and absolute. There was no negotiation, no middle ground. There was only capitulation or total annihilation. Stripped of every last shred of leverage, David stared at the report, then at his father. The coldness in his eyes from their last meeting was gone, replaced by the hollow look of utter defeat. The architect of deceit had been outmaneuvered, his own creation turned into the walls of his prison. He picked up the pen. The legal and financial victory was absolute, executed with the cold precision of a blueprint. The real wreckage, however, could not be quantified on a balance sheet. The first casualty was the Sunday family dinner. The silence from Chloe's end of the phone was a wound in itself. When she finally came to see him, she came alone. She sat in the same wingback chair from which she had watched his 60th birthday party unfold, a lifetime ago. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with a pain that tore at Arthur's carefully constructed composure. She was caught in an impossible crossfire, loyal to a father, a brother, and a husband, all of whom now occupied opposing sides of an unbridgeable canyon. "He won't talk about it," she said, her voice small. "Marcus. He just says you destroyed them. That you were vindictive. David. David said you threatened them with prison. Is that true, Dad?" Arthur looked at his daughter, the girl whose scraped knees he had bandaged and whose first architectural sketches he had praised. Explaining the complexities of fiduciary duty and corporate fraud felt like trying to describe the color of the sky to someone born blind. "Yes," he answered, the word heavy and unadorned. "It's true." Chloe flinched as if head struck her. "How could you?" "Yes, your son. Your family. They left me no other choice," Arthur said, his voice imbued with a deep, aching weariness. He did not raise it. He simply stated the fact as he would state the load-bearing capacity of a steel beam. This was never about revenge, Chloe. This was a salvage operation. They weren't just taking money. They were bankrupting the firm, deliberately. Do you know what that means? 200 employees would have lost their jobs. Their pensions, their healthcare, gone. Decades of trust with clients, vaporized. All so David and Marcus could build their own kingdom on the rubble. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. They made a choice. They chose to betray every principle I built that company on. They chose to gamble with the livelihoods of hundreds of families. My choice was to stop them. The method was the only one they left me. He could see the conflict warring in her eyes, the daughter who loved her father, the sister who loved her brother, the wife who loved her husband. But prison, Dad. Was that necessary? It was a lever, Arthur explained gently. The only one strong enough to avert a catastrophe without a long, public court battle that would have accomplished the same thing as their plan: the complete destruction of the company's reputation. I gave them a choice: a quiet, private consequence for their actions, or a loud, public one. I didn't make them sign the papers, Chloe. Their own actions did. She began to cry then, silent, heartbroken tears that tracked down her cheeks. He wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but he felt an invisible wall between them. He had saved his company, but in doing so, he had fractured his family. He had been forced to become the villain in his children's story to avoid becoming a victim in theirs. Later that night, alone in his study, he picked up a silver-framed photograph from his desk. It was from a family vacation years ago. A younger Arthur stood on a beach, his arm around his wife, Eleanor. A teenage David, all gangly limbs and a cocky grin, stood on one side, while a smiling Chloe stood on the other. It was a picture of a perfect structure, a family unit built on love and shared history. Now, it felt like a lie. Or worse, a relic from a civilization that no longer existed. He had won the war, but the cost was tallied in every empty chair at the dinner table, in every phone call that didn't come. The company was secure. The legacy was safe. But the photograph felt fractured, its perfect image cracked right down the middle. 6 months passed. The name on the frosted glass of the 40th floor lobby now read Sterling, Barga Associates. The ampersand felt significant, a symbol of partnership, not just succession. Inside, the firm was alive with a renewed, focused energy. The atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that had permeated under David and Marcus's reign had been replaced by a quiet, collaborative hum. Projects that had been neglected were revived. Clients who had been on the verge of leaving had returned, reassured by Arthur's steady hand and Elena Vargas' innovative vision. Arthur sat at the head of the conference table, but it was Elena who was presenting. He had made her a full partner, a decision announced at an all-staff meeting that had been met with a standing ovation. She was the future he had always envisioned for the firm, brilliant, ethical, and more interested in building legacies than in chasing quarterly profits. She was outlining a proposal for a new sustainable urban housing project, her passion for the design evident in every word. The room was rapt. Key team members, the ones he had spoken to in quiet cafes, now offered insights and creative solutions openly, their talent unshackled. He looked around the table at the faces, both old and new. He saw loyalty. He saw relief. He saw a future. From a business perspective, the victory was undeniable. They had not only salvaged the company, they were making it stronger, more resilient, and more principled than it had been in years. The debts were restructured, the stolen funds were being systematically recovered from Paragon's liquidated assets, and the firm's reputation, once tarnished, was being polished back to a high shine. Justice, in its clinical, corporate form, had been perfectly served. Yet, later that evening, as he stood in his silent study, the satisfaction felt distant, academic. The room was exactly as it had always been, but it felt altered, the air heavy with unspoken words. On the corner of his desk sat a Christmas card. It had arrived that morning. The picture on the front was of his 2 grandchildren, smiling in festive sweaters. Inside, the message was painfully brief. Thinking of you. Chloe. Marcus's name was conspicuously absent. So was David's. It was a message from a hostage, a desperate signal from across a divide he had created. Eleanor found him there, staring at the card as if it were an unreadable blueprint. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch of familiar comfort in the new emptiness of their lives. "Have you thought about calling him?" she asked softly. She didn't need to say the name. "What would I say, Eleanor?" Arthur murmured, his gaze still fixed on Chloe's neat handwriting. "I did what I had to do." He did what he did. The lines have been drawn. There are some structures that, once broken, can't be repaired. You can patch them, you can shore them up, but they are never truly whole again. He had not seen or spoken to David since that final, terrible meeting in the boardroom. He had heard, through Isabel, that David and Marcus had moved to the West Coast, seeking to start over in a city where their names meant nothing. They had walked away with nothing, just as he had promised. He had won. He had erased their threat. And in doing so, he had erased his son. He walked back to his old office at the firm late one night, needing the familiar comfort of the space he had created. He stood at the great window, looking out at the glittering tapestry of the city. He could point to a dozen buildings out there, landmarks of steel and glass that had come from his mind, from the firm that bore his name. This was what he had fought for. This tangible legacy, this hive of creativity and commerce that employed hundreds, that shaped the very skyline. It was real. It was secure. He turned from the window and his eyes fell on the silver-framed photograph he had brought back to his desk. The smiling family on the beach. He thought of the empty chair at their Thanksgiving table, a void that no amount of professional success could ever fill. He had faced a terrible choice to sacrifice one creation to save another. He had chosen to save the one that provided for the many, the one built of concrete and principle. But the cost was the one built of blood and love. The victory was not hollow, he realized. It was just heavy. It was the weight of a necessary act, a defensive war that had saved the country but lost a son. Justice had been done, the balance sheets were clean, and the future of the firm was bright. But in the quiet of his reclaimed office, surrounded by the monuments of his success, Arthur Sterling understood the profound, tragic moral of his story: some foundations, once destroyed, can never be rebuilt. And so, Arthur's battle ends not with a triumphant cheer, but with a quiet, heavy silence. The same mahogany table where his son saw only a relic became the stage for a tragic, necessary lesson in consequence. True victory, as Arthur learned, isn't just about reclaiming what was stolen, but about enduring the profound cost of what can never be restored. It's a powerful and bittersweet story, and we're so glad we could share it with you here on Content Channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Arthur was justified in using the threat of prison against his own son, or did his pursuit of justice cross a moral line? Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. And maybe one day, we'll find out if a daughter caught in the crossfire can ever build a bridge across the ruins her family left behind.